Tony Sheldon, Alan Joyce says the unions were going to disrupt 10,000 passengers a week for the next year in its industrial campaign. What other choice did he have then but to force this to a head?
Well, this is one of the things that's the absolute lie in this argument, and that is that there's been less than 8 days' worth of industrial action in the last 7 months of negotiations. What became clear is that up until the 26th of October, there were propositions being put to a workplace representatives negotiating committee for over 4,500 workers at Qantas in the areas that we cover. There was negotiations taking place. It's supposed to have taken place on Monday with the pilots union, and there was no industrial action taken by any one of those three unions. Oh, actually, I've got that quite slightly wrong. The pilots were wearing red ties saying, "Have Australian pilots fly Qantas flights." That is the only industrial action that was taking place. This is a premeditated strategy by the company to dislocate 80,000 passengers around the country, and more critically, their ultimate aim is to not employ another Qantas staff employee, send them overseas.
But even so, there was a great deal of uncertainty around what was going on. Bookings on Qantas have been down this year partly because people fear that they'll book and then there'll be some sort of industrial action that will derail their plans. So do the unions accept some fault in this dispute and some share of the blame in the damage to Qantas's brand?
Look, Lee, I think you've got to cast what's happened over the last number of months. So the company's refused to negotiate with any of the parties about putting offers. They only started making offers 2 weeks ago and then instructed the negotiating team from the workplace representatives, "You are not allowed to talk to the employees about it, and we're going to lock you out."
So the unions are entirely blameless, is that what you're saying?
Quite clearly, both parties have to come together to reach an agreement. We made a series of movements and we were prepared to negotiate and discuss with the employees about some broad propositions that the company and ourselves were in detailed conversation about. But the company said, "You either accept or reject this offer by 5 o'clock this afternoon." We don't operate that way. We talk to our workforce. That's how democratic unions operate, and the company knows that. Okay. They intended on having an industrial dispute.
Okay, but on some of the points, some of the things that affected unions are seeking, some of them are job security guarantees. Who in this day and age can ask for a job security guarantee? Lee,
that's another false suggestion by Qantas. We've had flexibility within Qantas for a very long time. For the last 20 years that the company's been privatised, it's turned a profit, $552 million pre-tax this year. And on 3 separate occasions, the workforce has taken wage freezes from 2, 1 and longer periods when there's been pressure on the company. And we're proud to say, as a union representing Qantas workers, as the Qantas workers are, that they've actually had a profitable company for every year for 20 years.
But we know that the international operations part of Qantas is lost about $200 million last year. They need to find some ways to cut costs, don't they, to keep this airline viable?
Well, Lee, this is another false proposition from Qantas. In actual fact, they've been asked to answer 69 examples of where they have put costs from Jetstar Asia, onto the Qantas books, and they failed to answer any one of those questions that we've put to them, and they've been put to them months ago. In addition to that, if they lost, let's just say that Alan Joyce, and I've put this to him directly, and more than one occasion, he's yet to answer it. If they lost $200 million, which has not been proven, then they've lost $250 million, they say, on Japan natural disasters in New Zealand, and they've made $553 million. That's nearly $1 billion created largely by the domestic outfit, but they are slashing hundreds of jobs and exporting Qantas jobs overseas regardless.
But do you accept that other airlines are able to offer cheaper fares than Qantas on the same routes, and so Qantas, if it's to remain viable, has to find a way to offer those same routes for less money?
Well, look, I think that's, this is another, furphy from Qantas. They've actually controlled 65% of the domestic market since the early 2000s. Virgin, whilst the market's been growing, has had very little impact to date on Qantas's control of the market. They generate close to 73% of profit on the domestic market. They are a very powerful company with a very powerful interest, and one that now they want to send the jobs overseas because they see cheap labour overseas as the way for them to operate, to make more money.
Do you accept that Qantas's management and board have a right to run the business as they see fit?
Look, there's no question about that boards have the responsibility to make decisions, and quite rightly the workforce can say whether they agree or disagree. But when it comes to very basic rights when it comes to very basic regulations, Qantas has made this decision. They have now been brought Asian Jetstar operations into Australia. They fly them in and out of this country internationally and pay flight attendants $400 a month to work 3 to 5 days a week on the Australian routes. That's improper. That's not what an Australian company should be doing, and that's certainly not a new spirit.
Tony Sheldon, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Let's go straight to Canberra now, where the Federal Transport Minister, Anthony Albanese, has been listening in. Minister, I wanted to ask you firstly, did Alan Joyce personally call you yesterday to inform you of Qantas's decision?
Yes, he did. He returned my call. The process was someone from a Qantas representative rang someone from my staff. They rang me and said that Alan would be calling me. That's not unusual in terms of arrangements to check that I was available. I rang him when the phone didn't ring after a period of time, and he rang me back.
Is that the sort of courtesy you'd expect, though, for something of this magnitude, that you would have not been able to get on to the head of Qantas?
Well, I would have expected, frankly, that this issue would have been raised beforehand. Mr Joyce said himself in his press conference last night that this was, to quote him, an unbelievable decision. The decision to ground Qantas completely, both domestic and internationally, has obvious ramifications for the company, for its workforce, for the travelling public and for the economy. And what I was surprised by was the fact that up to that point, at no stage had Qantas called for government intervention. At no stage had Qantas, for example, raised the prospect, which is available to them, by the way, of going before Fair Work Australia under Section 424, the same section in which the Australian government went to Fair Work Australia last night and asked for an end to the bargaining period.
OK, you say that you were surprised it wasn't raised earlier. How many conversations or face-to-face meetings had you had with Alan Joyce in recent weeks?
I certainly have had a number of discussions with Mr Joyce. I have a good relationship with him.
And in hindsight, was there a hint in any of those discussions that things were going to escalate to this level?
Certainly the fact that I'd had a number of face-to-face discussions in the preceding week, a number of phone calls, and certainly I was taken aback by the discussion I had with Mr Joyce. As you would expect, I have discussions with senior executives as well as union officials and other people in the sector. I don't go into those private discussions.
Well, can I ask you sorry to interrupt, but could I ask you broadly, perhaps to explain in those discussions you were having then, what indications was he giving about how Qantas was intending to resolve this dispute?
Well, certainly the government's played a role in attempting to facilitate discussions between the two parties. What is clear here, Lee, is that there is a common interest. You cannot have a successful Qantas if you don't have a successful workforce, a relationship. The two are interdependent. And what the government has attempted to point out here, over and over, to both parties, both the unions and to Qantas, is that it is about time that they acted like adults, acknowledge that they have a common interest and get an arrangement done in the interests of themselves, in terms of the company, in the interests of the workforce, but also in the interests of the nation, given Qantas's importance as an iconic brand for Australia.
Minister, two state premiers asked the federal government last week to intervene in the dispute. There's been a steady escalation in rhetoric coming out of Qantas, including that they were considering sacking staff. The online travel agency Webjet begged for government intervention. Why did these things not set off alarm bells to you that this dispute was potentially getting out of hand and maybe required the federal government to take some firmer steps?
Well, of course, I noticed the Victorian Industrial Relations Minister's comments last night and was somewhat bemused by them, given that the Victorian government or the New South Wales government could themselves have made an application to Fair Work Australia under the very provisions which we did last night. They chose not to do so, but to ask the federal government to do so. So I think that should be seen for the political move that it was. The fact that it appeared on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, the alleged letter to the Prime Minister before the Prime Minister had received it, I think said a lot about what the motive was there.
Alan Joyce has said that if Fair Work Australia decides to opt for a suspension rather than a termination of the industrial action, that he will possibly keep planes grounded. What do you say to that?
Well, the government has made an application. We want to see a termination as well. We have a common position with Qantas on that issue. However, we do have a view that the actions by Qantas yesterday, which have caused a great inconvenience to many thousands of people, were not warranted under the circumstances whereby there wasn't impending industrial action. And certainly the circumstances were, in my view, there that this was an escalation of the dispute, given that before that point Qantas had at no stage, publicly or privately, called for government intervention into this dispute.
Okay, the Transport Minister Anthony Albanese, thank you very much.